The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I will now make an opening statement, then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. And I'm going to guess we have votes around 3:30, so we'll try to get through as much as we can. First, I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Yoho, members of the subcommittee, and our witnesses for today's hearing. Obviously, a very, very timely hearing, this being March 10th. Our modern involvement in Afghanistan was born out of that brutally tragic day of 9/11. That was a turning point in American history. It was also a defining day in our relationship with Afghanistan and its people, which led to the entry of American and NATO troops in the country, a decision that I supported. Nearly 20 years later, we're still there. According to some accounts, we've lost nearly 2,500 American lives, tens of thousands of American wounded, and spent over $1 trillion on military and development assistance. The toll on the Afghan people has been even greater. UN reports released last month documented over 100,000 civilians killed or injured in the last 10 years. Yeah, this is complicated. The Bush and Obama administrations and now the Trump administration have each tried to bring America's longest war to a close. And President Trump has been particularly upfront about bringing troops back home. With that, he's empowered former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, to negotiate directly with the Taliban, which led us to the signing of the recent peace deal. The U.S. Taliban signed peace deal calls for complete U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan within 14 months. That was in exchange for Taliban commitment to not provide safe harbor for those who attack the U.S. or our allies. The next phase is negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but as we've seen, the Afghans have formed two governments, so that clearly looks like it'll be a difficult negotiation. And then the signing came after a successful 7-day reduction in violence. Thus far, it does indicate that neither the U.S. Taliban or Afghan government carry out any offensive security processes, which we've also seen is going to be very difficult. Within a week, the Taliban launched an attack on Afghan government in Helmand province. Then the U.S. launched an airstrike on the Taliban. The week of peace has ended. Negotiations between the Taliban and Afghan government are going to be even harder to carry out. As mentioned earlier, they were slated to begin today, but both President Ghani and CEO Abdullah declared themselves the winner of the presidential election, and both are forming their own governments. We've got distinguished witnesses here today who have gone through this process previously, both in Republican and Democratic administrations, and understand the complexity of where we go from here. I take at face value President Trump's desire to help bring to a close, and the ranking member and I have had conversations about this, and we don't see this as a partisan issue. I think there's an overwhelming sentiment in Congress that we would like to bring a close to America's longest war, with an understanding and recognition that we do have security interests there. We do want to create an environment where we're not going back to Afghanistan 10 years from now, facing a new counterterrorism threat. And I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses and the insight that they can offer, as well as the members on this subcommittee, on how Congress, working with the administration, can move forward in this process. And with that, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today and looking into a path forward for peace and stability. And I find it interesting that you're okay going into Afghanistan. I wasn't. I was a civilian, and as I think you were. We're on different sides there, but I'm glad we're at where we're at today. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today, Ms. Laurel Miller from the International Crisis Group, Mr. Douglas Lute from the Belfer Center, and Mr. Luke Coffey from the Heritage. I'm sorry, Ambassador. I meant to say Ambassador. I look forward to hearing from all of you on the prospects of achieving lasting, and I'm going to say it again, lasting peace in Afghanistan. The peace deal signed between the representatives from the United States and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, known as the Taliban from here on out in this, a deal that was 18 months in the making, was a momentous step forward in paving the way for peace in a conflict that has lasted almost 2 decades and claimed the lives of thousands of Americans along with tens of thousands of Afghanistan soldiers and civilians and trillions of dollars. To the American men and women who gave their lives in Afghanistan along with the many thousands who served, we owe a debt of gratitude, and we have to make sure they get taken care of from here on out. We can repay that debt now by ensuring their sacrifice was not in vain and secure a genuine and lasting peace for the people of Afghanistan. Under the terms of the deal, our forces will withdraw during a 14-month time frame with over 4,000 troops set to withdraw in the first 135 days. Prisoner exchanges are also part of the deal, where a number of Taliban prisoners will be exchanged for Afghan security forces taken prisoner. This agreement is not an easy one to make, and I applaud the administration for arriving at a mutually acceptable terms for a conflict that still breeds an incredible amount of hate and distrust. However, the road ahead for peace is a long one, and the United States must remain vigilant in preserving the terms of the deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Most importantly, this deal must ensure that Afghanistan will never again become a safe haven for terrorists again. One of the major factors determining the stability of this deal lies in limiting the outbreaks of violence, like the episode we have seen in the weeks following the signing of the peace deal. Within days of signing the peace agreement, the Taliban resumed attacks against the Afghan government forces. U.S. forces responded with the airstrikes against the Taliban soon after as a defensive strike to disrupt their advance on Afghan security forces. If the Taliban is serious about maintaining peace in Afghanistan, this violence must end. It has to end. Should fighting be perpetuated by the Taliban, the administration must consider a delay in the withdrawal of American forces as a measure of maintaining regional stability. And make no mistake, the wherewithal and the resolution of the American government will follow through on that. And that's something the Taliban needs to keep in mind. Many barriers stand in the way of peace in Afghanistan. It is the hopes of this subcommittee and Congress as a whole that a peaceful end of America's involvement in Afghanistan can be reached without jeopardizing innocent Afghan lives living under the democratically controlled areas of that country. America continues to stand for freedom and liberty abroad, and I look forward to hearing from our experts today on how we can continue to responsibly export those values while avoiding unnecessary entanglement in bloody conflicts on foreign soils. And I yield back.
I'm pleased to welcome our witnesses to today's hearing. Ms. Laurel Miller is our first witness, is currently the director of the Asia program at the International Crisis Group and is a former acting State Department Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ambassador Douglas Lute most recently served as the former U.S. Ambassador to NATO and as a White House advisor in the Bush and Obama administrations on Afghanistan. And Mr. Luke Coffey is the director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation and a former special senior advisor to the British Defense Secretary. Please summarize your written statements to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Ms. Miller, if you could begin.
I'll start that again. Good afternoon, Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Yoho, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I will summarize my written testimony, focusing on what the U.S. Taliban deal means for U.S. policy looking ahead. The essence of the bargain, as you noted, is a U.S. commitment to withdraw all forces from Afghanistan within 14 months in exchange for a Taliban commitment to prevent al-Qaeda and any other group or individual from using Afghan soil to threaten the U.S. and its allies. It also includes a Taliban commitment to enter into Afghan peace negotiations, a process that was supposed to start today. The U.S. withdrawal timeline is conditioned on the Taliban's, quote, commitment and action, close quote, on its anti-terrorism obligations. That's all the publicly available agreement says about the drawdown conditionality. The vagueness leaves the U.S. wide latitude to judge the sufficiency of Taliban action in ways that are not spelled out. Debate about the agreement has raised the question whether it is a peace deal or just a withdrawal deal. In my view, this is the wrong question because the first characterization oversells the agreement and the second one undervalues it. The deal is not a peace agreement. Even full implementation would not bring peace to Afghanistan because only a political settlement among the Afghans can do that. The deal does, however, create an opportunity for Afghans to reach a political settlement because it commits the Taliban to negotiate with other Afghans, which previously they hadn't been willing to do. The deal is unquestionably a withdrawal agreement in that it sets out terms for the complete pullout of foreign forces. But the withdrawal commitment is inextricably linked to the potential for a negotiated peace. Because of the Taliban's longstanding primary demand for the complete end of the foreign military presence, there is no realistic prospect of a negotiated end to the war that doesn't include the promise of a U.S. military withdrawal. For the war to end that way, sooner or later, the U.S. would have to commit to pulling out. Making the withdrawal commitment prior to the start of the Afghans' peace negotiations was a concession to the Taliban, but it was one the U.S. had to make to jumpstart the talks. Years of U.S. efforts to catalyze a peace process without making that concession had failed. The U.S. has a starker choice to make than some would prefer. Some who are uncomfortable with both endless war and the risk entailed by complete withdrawal have suggested the U.S. military should indefinitely maintain a small number of forces in Afghanistan. That idea fails to grapple with the Taliban's refusal to countenance agreeing to a continued military presence, no matter the size. Either the U.S. can keep forces in Afghanistan, or it can enable the possibility of a political settlement by agreeing to withdraw, but it can't do both. The agreement includes a timeline for complete withdrawal, so it seems that this choice has been made, but the fuzziness of the withdrawal conditionality might indicate the U.S. hasn't fully resolved its internal policy struggle over whether it really intends to pull out, despite President Trump being clear about his preference and despite diminished public support for the deal. For the war, that is. If Afghan talks get going and produce a peace agreement, there will be no basis for the U.S. to keep any forces in Afghanistan, including for a counterterrorism mission. The Taliban would have to change its viewpoint on the presence of foreign forces 180 degrees to accept that. The U.S. would, however, be able to maintain and secure its embassy and provide necessary diplomatic and financial support for implementation of an agreement. If the peace process collapses, however, the war will persist. In that scenario, if the U.S. decides to keep troops in Afghanistan, it's doubtful the numbers could dip very far. The Afghan government would not likely consent to a force presence focused only on serving U.S. counterterrorism interests and not postured to back up the government in its existential fight against the insurgency. If the U.S. withdraws fully in the absence of a settlement, the conflict would spiral into an intensified, multi-sided civil war. The embassy would probably have to be evacuated, and assistance would be greatly reduced. It's also possible the Afghans will negotiate just long enough for the U.S. to finish its withdrawal. That risk can be mitigated but not eliminated. Another unavoidable risk is that they conclude a peace agreement, but it later falls apart, as many do. The next stage of talks is going to be much tougher than the one just finished. The Taliban have not had to make any difficult compromises yet, so their willingness and ability to do so hasn't been tested. And on the other side of the table, political disunity among factions and ethnic groups is a grave problem. It's not clear yet whether the maximalists or those more amenable to compromise will be dominant on either side. Even with these and other likely problems, pushing for the best use of what chance there is for a peace process to work is better than any of the alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Ambassador DeLutte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thanks for this opportunity to appear today to discuss Afghanistan. In this statement, I'll briefly outline my views on the vital U.S. interests at stake, the recent agreement between the United States and the Taliban, and some thoughts on the way forward. As background, I served for 6 years in the White House under Presidents Bush and Obama, helping to coordinate our efforts in Afghanistan and the region. More specifically, I was involved in 2010, so nearly 10 years ago exactly, in our first direct diplomatic contact with the Taliban. This was based on the political commission that was at that time located in Doha, Qatar, and I helped oversee, with others, our continued outreach to the Taliban through 2013, when I moved out of the White House and became the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Let me begin my statement today where all U.S. policy discussions should begin: American national interests. In my view, the only vital American interest at stake in Afghanistan is to counter terrorist groups that have the potential to strike the United States, its citizens, and our treaty allies. Indeed, this purpose mirrors the original purpose of our intervention just weeks after 9/11 in 2001, and it remains the core reason for our effort over the last 18 years. Of course, we have other less than vital interests in Afghanistan as well, and this committee may wish to discuss these, but the essential purpose for the United States is to counter terrorism. In my estimation, we have largely achieved our counterterrorism objective today. Al-Qaeda is much diminished in Afghanistan and Pakistan, with most of its senior leaders killed and those who remain marginalized. The threat from Al-Qaeda and its affiliates is greater elsewhere, including Yemen, Somalia, and Syria. There is a branch of the so-called Islamic State in Afghanistan, but I've seen no evidence that that branch represents a threat to the United States today, and it is actually under pressure from the Afghans, including, ironically, from the Taliban. This potential Islamic State threat should be monitored. I begin with this point about America's vital interest because that interest is at the heart of the recent agreement with the Taliban. The agreement could actually be retitled an agreement on countering terrorism, because that is what it actually promises. In return for the gradual withdrawal of American and allied forces from Afghanistan, the Taliban have agreed to take steps to ensure that transnational terrorists will not operate from Afghanistan. On these points, the agreement is the most significant step forward in the past decade. The agreement, however, does not deliver peace, and here I agree with Laurel Miller's comments. While it is a step in the right direction, the path to peace will be long and extremely difficult. We are likely years away from an agreement among all Afghans, including the Taliban, on how Afghanistan will be governed and when violent conflict will end. While the United States and other international players can set the stage for such progress, only Afghans can deliver compromises required to bring to an end the past 40 years of conflict. As Americans, we get sort of fixated on our involvement, but for Afghans, this actually goes back 2 decades earlier, so a total of nearly 40 years of conflict. It's up to Afghans to decide if they wish to compromise and step forward together or to continue to fight in a winner-take-all struggle. In the near term, several questions arise that will signal the prospects for peace. First, is the withdrawal of American forces really conditions-based, as some of the public statements reveal, or will it follow the letter of the agreement on a 14-month timeline? So is this really conditions-based? Second, today, March 10th, the agreement calls for a release of prisoners on both sides, but the Afghan government clearly has not agreed to that release. So here we have the very first milestone mentioned in the agreement, and as we talk today, it's not being met. What impact does this early disconnect between the agreement and the arrangement with the Afghan government, what does this early disconnect say about longer-term prospects? Third, and perhaps most difficult, can the Afghan government form a coherent, inclusive negotiating team that is capable of engaging seriously the Taliban? Here, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned in your opening comments the dueling inauguration ceremonies that we had in Kabul doesn't bode well for some sort of coherent Afghan approach to dealing with the Taliban. Again, the agreement calls for such intra-Afghan talks, that is, the Afghan government, broader Afghan society, and the Taliban, to begin today. Well, they didn't begin today. So we've missed the first 2 deadlines, if you will, marked in the agreement. These three questions are early signposts as to whether the recent agreement will lead to deeper, more durable solutions to the Afghan war. In short, whether the current agreement will be a catalyst, a precursor to a true peace agreement. Now, in closing, what can the United States do to influence events going forward? First, we must test the Taliban's commitment to fulfill the recent agreement. Our ranking member, I think you mentioned this in your comments. We must hold them to their obligations, especially with regard to counterterrorism. Second, we need to press the Afghan government urgently to form an inclusive team and move into negotiations with the Taliban, as the agreement suggests. This means the political elite in Kabul must come together despite the continued disputes surrounding last year's presidential elections, and further broaden a team to represent all major elements of Afghan society, including Afghan women. We have influence with the Afghan government, and we must use it, including our providing about 75% of the Afghan national budget every year. We will need to sustain this economic support to sustain our influence. And finally, in my view, it is time to internationalize the diplomacy in search of peace in Afghanistan. It's right that the United States took the lead up to now in crafting the initial agreement with the Taliban. Now is the time, however, to bring our allies and partners more prominently into play. For example, there are reports that Norway has agreed or has offered to host the inter-Afghan talks. That's progress. The international community will need to continue to support Afghanistan financially. We should seek a United Nations Security Council resolution in support of the peace process, bringing both Russia and China prominently on board and in line with the progress. And finally, the likely long and difficult path towards peace requires a UN-appointed senior diplomat to guide the parties to peace. These steps can significantly improve the prospects for an overall agreement. Thank you, and I'm ready to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Lute. Mr. Coffey.
Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Yoho, and distinguished members of this committee, I'm honored to speak here today before this esteemed committee about Afghanistan. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I will summarize my prepared statement that has been submitted for the record. To examine the prospects for peace in Afghanistan, we have to first understand how we got to where we are today. Just after 9/11, there were two main goals for Afghanistan. The first was to deny al-Qaeda a safe haven. The second was to remove the Taliban from power as punishment for not cooperating. Both were accomplished with relative speed. As the years went by, the explanation for what we were doing in Afghanistan shifted from America's national security needs to more vague notions of nation building. With the lofty goals of nation building defining our success in the earlier days of the campaign, it is only natural that all most people see today in Afghanistan is failure. But what we need in Afghanistan is actually a reality check. Success is not when 100% of the country is controlled by the Afghan government or when there's no more suicide bombings, nor is success achieved when every road is paved, everyone goes to school, or everyone gets the right to vote. These are noble objectives, and we should aspire to them. But these are neither the reasons why we went to Afghanistan, nor are they the reasons why we should remain. Success is achieved when there is a stable enough Afghanistan able to manage its own internal security so it does not become a base for international terrorism once again. Nothing more and nothing less. For the Afghan people who have suffered more than 40 years of war, and for the American family and the American taxpayer that has sacrificed so much over the past 19 years, the current peace plan, in my opinion, is a realistic, responsible, and reasonable approach to take. The Afghan government, with the help of the U.S. and international community, has been fighting a Taliban-led insurgency. The goal of any counterinsurgency campaign is to allow those who have political grievances the ability to address these grievances through a political process and not through violence. History shows that most insurgencies are successfully brought to an end through some sort of political settlement, and this is why you can no more kill your way out of an insurgency than you can drink yourself out of alcoholism. Mr. Chairman, this is why the intra-Afghan talks are the crucial stage in this peace process. There will be no meaningful deal whatsoever unless there is an agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. But for the U.S.-Taliban agreement, there are three key issues that warrant further attention. First, the contentious issue of prisoner swaps. Thankfully, President Ghani's recent comments have helped to clarify this matter. And as I mentioned in my prepared statement, I think most of the original confusion is down to the inconsistent wording that's used in the U.S. Taliban and the U.S. Afghan government statements. Secondly, the so-called, quote, guarantees and enforcement mechanisms, unquote, to ensure that the Taliban once again does not harbor transnational terrorists. Since preventing Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for transnational terrorism is our #1 priority, it is important to know what these enforcement mechanisms will be and how they will work. Finally, more details on how the U.S. can continue to support the Afghan security forces if indeed all U.S. and foreign troops are withdrawn. This should include a possible commitment to fund the Afghan security forces and the possibility of training them in a neighboring country. Over the years, the focus on nation building resulted in expectations set so high that even the obvious successes on the security front were never considered good enough. You often hear that the Taliban are on the front foot or that the past 19 years were for nothing. This is nonsense. The Taliban today is nothing like the group in the mid-1990s when it seized major cities like Kandahar and Kabul using tanks and military aircraft. On September 10th, 2001, the Taliban controlled 90% of the country, including every major urban center and every major road network. Today, according to my open source analysis, the Taliban probably controls about 11% of Afghanistan's districts. Since being ousted from power in December of 2001, the Taliban has never genuinely threatened the capital of Kabul. In the past 19 years, the Taliban has only seized a provincial capital twice, and each time for only a few days at a time. No transnational terrorist group, including Al-Qaeda, operating from Afghanistan, has successfully attacked our homeland since 9/11. Mr. Chairman, after almost 20 years of military involvement, maybe we should come to terms with the fact that until there is a political settlement, what we see in Afghanistan might be as good as it's going to get. And this is not defeat, this is reality. As a young Winston Churchill said in 1897 when he was fighting as a young British Army officer on what is today the modern Afghan-Pakistan border, and I quote, "There are no general actions on a great scale, no brilliant successes, no important surrenders, and no chance for a coup de theater. It is just a rough, hard job which must be carried through. The war is one of small incidents. The victory must be looked for in the results. What was true in 1897 is true in 2020. Our involvement in Afghanistan has not always been perfect, and there will be setbacks in the coming months regarding the intra-Afghan talks. But as Churchill reminds us, it is a rough, hard job. As long as America and its allies remain safe, and as long as the Afghan people get to experience some peace, then this process is worth a shot. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I will now turn to my opening statement, and then I'll recognize the ranking member and our other members for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning the witnesses. You've all laid out the complexity of this and how difficult this is. Ambassador Lute, you've had a long career, first 35 years in the military, and then at the highest levels of the Bush and Obama administration working on these very issues that we're talking about and directly negotiating with the Taliban. I think you've outlined our national interests and objectives, which I think all the members up here would agree in the counterterrorism space. But as we think about the framework of the fact that we've missed the first two milestones, that there's a higher probability of Afghanistan falling into disarray than there is of reaching a political solution. I'd be curious of what you see the U.S.-Taliban relationship moving forward. If Afghanistan is to fall into a civil war, we've got our interest on the counterterrorism side. I don't think there'd be an appetite, if we withdraw fully of our troops, and let's say Kabul's under siege, to now ramp up and send another 100,000 troops into Afghanistan to try to save I don't think the public will would be there, and I'm not certain the congressional will would be there. And how do we kind of balance this from your military experience as well as your understanding? Because I'd hate to see that situation where we're watching the country fall apart into a civil war, Kabul under attack, and trying to decide what we do.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think of the three potential options. So continued stalemate, a peace agreement of some sort among the Afghans, and civil war. The worst possible outcome is civil war. I mean, we're better off staying where we are, despite the costs at stalemate, than we are letting this slip into civil war. And the reason for that is that it would risk our vital national interests. It would be uncontrollable in terms of monitoring and contending with transnational terrorists if there's complete chaos in Afghanistan. So the one thing we certainly want to avoid is worsening the situation, and that would be civil war. But there's a risk of that. If we withdraw precipitously and just leave this to the Afghans, and not stay involved politically, and not continue to finance the Afghan government and their security forces, there's a real risk that we could realize that worst possible outcome.
You know, if you were to put a percent, your best guess on those three possible outcomes, I agree with you. The worst possible outcome is a full-blown civil war. So that means, I won't ask you to put percentages on there. But that means we've got to put our full effort in trying to find an inter-Afghan peace deal. And maybe I'll ask Ms. Miller this because you've been in the middle of this. What are the, things that we should be doing at the congressional level and the administration certainly, but what's the prospects of, one, an inter-Afghan peace coming together, and then the Afghans finding a solution with the Taliban that doesn't devolve into kind of a civil war?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of bolstering the prospects for the peace process to work, unfortunately, the U.S. has more leverage over our Afghan government partner than we do over the Taliban in terms of their conduct in the peace process. But there are problems on the Afghan government side, and Doug alluded to them, that they are not organized for the talks. They do not have a coherent negotiating team. They've not been able to develop consensus positions on their side. So there is a need to be exerting leverage on the Afghan government side to get them to be willing to negotiate in good faith. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion of the concern about the maximalists on the Taliban side and those who may not be ready to make peace, but there are also maximalists on the Afghan government side, those who really are not genuinely interested in any kind of agreement that incorporates compromise. The U.S. also needs to be engaged intensively diplomatically with the countries of the region. With Pakistan, that continues to have influence over the Taliban, and although not directly with Iran, indirectly through other governments that do have relationships with Iran. And so that has to be an ongoing feature, even if the peace process gets going, not just to get it to launch. So there has to be very active diplomacy. There are also a number of practical steps that the U.S. can take, including to ensure that a mediator is appointed. I don't think it has to be a UN person. It could be another individual. But to ensure that the peace process itself is structured in a way that maximizes the potential for it to operate effectively. And there are a lot of lessons learned around the world from peace processes that can be applied to that. In terms of Congress's role, I do think at some stage, if there's a peace process going, that if the U.S. is in a position to signal that it will continue to provide some financial support if there's a peace agreement for its implementation, is something that can be useful in enabling the administration to exert what leverage the U.S. has.
Thank you for that, and I'm out of time. Let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for testifying. And I'm not sure where to start here. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Lute. You're talking about all discussion should focus and begin with national security, and I agree with that. And then we were talking about peace in Afghanistan. How do you define that? Because if you look at the history, I mean, there's been corruption, there's been all this stuff going on. I'm doing a quick search on that for a long time. And then prior to the war, as Mr. Coffey, you said Taliban controlled roughly 90% of that territory. So it was kind of a tribal type of organization, right? As far as the cohesiveness of any kind of structure in there. So what do we define as peace? Because I agree, we need to back out of there. We want to make sure that there is not a safe haven for terrorist groups. What is an acceptable level of conflict that we know is probably going to be there?
Well, I think peace would involve, on the conflict spectrum, essentially an end to this insurgency. So the Taliban and the Afghan government would have to come to compromise terms that undoubtedly, given the Taliban's position, will feature some sort of compromises that share power between the Afghan government and, by the way, the other Afghan political elite, because, as we've seen, the Afghan government itself is not coherent.
Right.
But among those parties and the Taliban. So peace would fundamentally mean that the fighting ends because the Taliban believe that they're sufficiently represented in a new power-sharing arrangement, perhaps a geographically bifurcated arrangement where the Taliban, for example, would have more control over rural Pashtun areas, while the standing political elite in Kabul more control over the large urban areas. But some sort of geographic power-sharing arrangement that allows the Taliban to set down their arms. And that will be, as we at one time said, Afghan good enough.
Is that something y'all feel like Norway, the Norwegians, can broker? Because when we sat with our negotiator, and he was saying they came to kind of a consensus with the people of the Taliban that they would accept some of these negotiations on peace deals. Not all the factions of the Taliban had agreed to who was in charge. And so if we're not actively negotiating, is that going to fall apart? And how strong are the Norwegians going to be able to kind of broker that and possibly help on that?
Actually, I think that's a very good point, and it's a reminder of why we need to manage our expectations. Even if there is some sort of intra-Afghan agreement, it will take a very long time. It will be a very messy process. And at the end of it, I do believe that there will be some sort of insurgency remaining in the country. India, the world's largest democracy, fights two major insurgencies against Maoist rebels and Assam separatists in their country today. Great Britain, until the mid-90s, fought an insurgency in Northern Ireland. And even in January, there were 2 cases of attempted car bombings in Northern Ireland.
Right.
So there will be an insurgency remaining, I think, in some part, in some fashion, for the foreseeable future. But the goal is to find a political settlement that brings peace to most of the country, that denies the chaotic space that facilitates and allows for transnational terrorism to operate and take root.
Sitting on this committee, I've had the privilege to talk to a lot of different countries around, and one of the things that was brought up by a country, and I won't name it, is they would be willing to negotiate a peace deal. They're a Muslim country because they understand that. And with us trying to negotiate in there, not understanding tribal cultures and things like that, and then the things that we recommend, women going to school, all those things we believe here, how hard is that for us to move our agenda forward, being a Western democracy versus a Muslim country willing to step up and help negotiate that? Any thoughts on that, Ms. Miller?
I don't expect the U.S. to be very involved in the substance of what a peace agreement is.
That's what I see.
I mean, frankly, I don't think it's realistic. And I don't see at this stage in time this administration or even a future administration being terribly interested in insisting on particular substance for the deal. I think the role that a mediator would play is truly that, mediating and trying to help the two sides to bridge some differences. But I do think there's a reality that we should be clear about, which is a peace agreement means the Taliban being in some substantial degree of power in Afghanistan. And The extent to which that means changes to the way that Afghanistan looks today is something that will have to be determined during the course of a peace negotiation. But that's what making a peace deal means. There isn't some magical reality that there's a peace agreement and the Taliban don't continue to exert.
I'm going to have to cut you off because I'm out of town,
Sure.
out of time. But I appreciate what you're saying, and I hope as we back out, that peace stays and that we don't see a resurgence of radical groups. Thank you.
Let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, and I share the sentiment of my friend from Florida, and that's what I'm worried about. Mr. Coffey, you talked about the security of Kabul and Kandahar, that the Taliban hadn't got their claws on those cities since 2001. Have you been to Kabul and Kandahar? And did
Yes, I have both.
And did you walk around freely, not worried about security?
Well, I served in the capacity of the U.S. Army in 2005.
right.
And then I served as an aide to the British
Right.
Defense Secretary.
But I can assure you, and I'm sure you will recall, they're hardly secure places in terms of individual mobility. So I think you overstate the fact that the Taliban doesn't control it hardly means they are secure places, and that we've secured them. We haven't. And it might also have something to do with the fact that you and your colleagues bravely served in those cities, which prevented the Taliban from retaking them. Just spitballing here. And once we withdraw, which we apparently are doing without conditions, as Ambassador Lute warns us about, the security of those places may very well collapse. We'll have to see. So I just caution you, and we can't be facile about security in Afghanistan, especially once there is a U.S. withdrawal. Ambassador Lute, were there clear conditions with metrics on the initial so-called peace agreement Ambassador Khalilzad signed with the Taliban?
So my reading of the agreement, which is public, and I know of no other annexes and so forth, I'm only reading what's public, the conditionality is very vague. And
Is what?
Is very vague.
Vague.
And ambiguous. It suggests that, for example, on the exchange of prisoners, that it will actually take place today, but yet the counterpart agreement, U.S. Afghan government, does not make that assurance. And as we've seen, that has broken down.
Well, it's also been made clear by President Ghani that he didn't agree to this prisoner exchange.
Exactly. So the conditions, I think, are ambiguous.
God, this sounds I'm of an age, and maybe you are too, this has a eerie resemblance to some other peace agreement where the United States sought to withdraw almost at any price. Yes, that's right, the Paris Agreement between Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho that led to the collapse of the South Vietnamese government. It seemed at that time, and certainly in history, that that was a fig leaf for the United States to justify its getting out at the expense of an awful lot of people who collaborated with and cooperated with the United States government. And I'm a little worried about that. Mr. Coffey says forthrightly that the only goal the United States had or has in Afghanistan is the fight against terrorism. Now, I would argue that was absolutely an accurate statement for 2001, 2002. But you can't pretend, as Mr. Coffey apparently wants us to do, that the intervening 20 years haven't occurred. Half the population of Afghanistan are called women, and we have led the liberation of women. We have insisted they be educated, that they be allowed outside of the home. And every one of those women is at risk if the Taliban takes over, let alone government officials, let alone cultural officials, let alone intellectuals, let alone academics, all of whom were targeted the last time the Taliban was in charge. Now, the question is, Mr. Coffey says it's not the same Taliban as 2001. Do we know that? Ms. Miller, am I right to be concerned that there are people at risk if we simply withdraw precipitately?
Yes, you are. I mean, we don't really know to what extent the Taliban has evolved. They may have to some extent. they claim to have, but they are extremely vague themselves about what their political vision is for Afghanistan. And if there was a withdrawal without a peace agreement, I do think you would see an intensified, multi-sided civil war, probably reminiscent of what we saw in the 1990s. On the question of the conditions, I agree with Doug that they're extremely vague. You could read that one of two ways. You could think, if you don't think the U.S. Should withdraw, you could think that's a good thing because it gives the U.S.-wide policy latitude to decide that unspecified conditions aren't met. On the other hand, it also gives the U.S. the policy latitude to simply abruptly withdraw whenever it chooses.
Yes. My concern is that there are unwitting victims who trusted the United States and its allies for 20 years. We may be tired of the war. We have reason to be tired of it. But we are where we are now. We're not back in 2001. And we created these circumstances domestically in terms of higher expectations. And every one of those people with those expectations is at risk of a Taliban takeover if we would withdraw precipitately without conditions that are clear with metrics and with the consent of the Afghan government. Otherwise, this looks like a cut-and-run kind of deal to protect the United States and only the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be the last guy up here to blame the United States for the problems in Afghanistan. We might have contributed to them with good intentions that went wrong, but they were good intentions nonetheless. And it's up to the problems of Afghanistan are born in Afghanistan. Let me say that. And just to continue the record regarding Vietnam, let's remember that there was a Congress that removed all funding from the military in Vietnam and left a Republican president no choice but to, as some people say, abandon our friends there. With that having been said, maybe Mr. Coffey, who are we depending on to ensure, as I understand it, that the Afghan soil will not be used against the security of the United States and its allies? Who are we depending on to make sure that that's the case?
In my opinion, this is one of the biggest questions resulting from the agreement with the Taliban. All it says is that there will be some sort of enforcement mechanism. There are no details whatsoever what this will be. And I think as policymakers start looking at this in more detail, we have to be worried about second and third order effects. For example, just one hypothetical scenario I could quickly paint is that we have the Gulf states are the trusted intermediary to observe this, and then a sizable amount of Gulf state military focus and capability and planning and resourcing is now devoted to Afghanistan at a time when Iran is being very active in the region. So again, we have to think about the second and third order effects on how we go about implementing this policy, but I agree it's completely vague. And right now, if you take it at face value, it's basically trusting the Taliban, which is
let me
questionable.
just add, for the record, too, that I, like most Americans, want to see us finish the mission and come home and be out of Afghanistan. At the same time, I find it abhorrent that we would hand any bit of it over to terrorists, the enemy, et cetera, and leave it in those circumstances. But I think your point is well made, and that's a huge concern. Let me ask, and if you want to impart on that a little bit more, just for the interest of time here, Mr. Ambassador, in light of what Mr. Coffey said, and assuming you kind of agree with that, if you want to embellish the point, what are our options as the United States if the Taliban, or the Afghan government for that matter, doesn't live up to its end of the deal? What are our options?
Well, we conduct, Congressman, we conduct counterterrorism operations offshore and from secure land bases all over the world, where we don't have, as we do in Afghanistan today, 13,000 American troops, which actually, the presence of those troops, in no small part, is the rallying cry for the Taliban.
Sure.
So there are techniques and methods that were not on the books in 2001 when we were attacked, that over the last 20 years, we've not stood still. And we have much greater intelligence capacity, especially penetration in that region, than we had prior to 9/11. We have much greater, much more sophisticated strike options to enforce the counterterrorism provisions of the agreement than we had 20 years ago. So I believe we can conduct counterterrorism in Afghanistan, if necessary, to enforce the agreement, much as we do elsewhere around the world.
So let me just develop that a little bit. Would you agree that some of our intelligence prowess in Afghanistan, enhanced as it is prior or in comparison to 20 years ago, one of the functions of that must be because we have human intelligence on the ground. We're all over. The United States and its allies are all over Afghanistan right now. But once we leave, certainly I think that it's going to be diminished. Would you agree or not agree?
The presence of 13,000 American troops.
Not only 13,000 American troops, not only, Okay, go ahead.
And others, right, do give us human intelligence that's very useful. But we also have sophisticated technical intelligence that we didn't have at the time.
So with the political
we're much
environment here, what we're potentially expecting this week or in the following weeks regarding an AUMF, we might have the capability. We have the capability to reach out and touch anybody around the world, but is the political will going to be there to do that? And are we going to have the approval of the Afghan government to come to their country and conduct counterintelligence or counter terrorist strikes in a sovereign nation without our presence there on the ground?
But if they approved of our presence on the ground, then it seems to me, even with a diminished presence, they'd approve of our support with.
We're making an agreement right now to leave.
I mean, we all agree with that. As to the potential of an AUMF, I mean, I can't, I'm not the best expert in the room in terms of the prospects of a new AUMF, but the one that exists gives us sufficient latitude, as we've demonstrated in the last 20 years, to strike pretty much wherever we want to around the world, if American security is at risk.
But thank you. I have to yield.
Thank you. Let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
A cynical politician, and I'm sure there are none of them here, would say that the administration would benefit the most with the maximum possible withdrawal accomplished by this fall, so long as the Taliban did not have the maximum possible power until next winter. The Israelis have come to the conclusion that often they cannot destroy a terrorist effort. They instead talk of mowing the grass. And so we either stay in Iraq, rather in Afghanistan, or we use our air power to make sure that terrorist groups don't have anything as big as Tora Bora ever again. We're not going to be able to prevent them from finding an apartment to plot something. They plotted 9/11 in an apartment in Hamburg. We went into Afghanistan. We failed. At the beginning, to create a viable and popular government. We did so in part because we were distracted by the invasion of Iraq, but in large part we failed because Pakistan did not want us to succeed. Pakistan would feel itself at great strategic problem if it had enemies both to the east and the west. And the Durand Line, which is the international accepted border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, is accepted internationally except by Afghanistan. Does Pakistan need to keep Afghanistan weak to protect its pushed-on inhabited territory and or prevent a being between a hostile India and a hostile Pakistan? Ms. Miller?
I wouldn't necessarily say Pakistan has to keep Afghanistan weak, but Pakistan does want the Taliban back into some share of power in Afghanistan. And they want that.
If you were aiming for weakness, you'd want neither the government in Kabul nor the Taliban to be in control. Has the Taliban ever accepted the Durran line? Could any Afghan
No.
government accept the Durran line?
I mean, the Pakistanis like to point out when they're of a mind to show the limitations of their influence over the Taliban. They like to point out that when the Taliban was the government in Afghanistan, they also didn't recognize the
And there
Durran
was, and that even the Taliban didn't control the north. If one wanted to make sure that an Afghan government could not unite the whole country, be strong, and perhaps covet Pakistani territory, you would look at the last 40 years and say mission accomplished. But I want to go on to something else. On Friday, two gunmen hit the crowd at a Kabul event. They seem to be trying to kill Abdullah Abdullah. Abdullah Abdullah is not on great terms with President Ghani. He's not on great terms with the Taliban, but neither seems to have been the source of this attack, or at least publicly. Instead, ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack. Should we believe them? Was this attack from ISIS? Ms. Miller again.
I don't have any independent information on that. They did claim it, and it is plausible, given that this was a gathering that was predominantly the minority Shia who have been regularly targeted by ISIS in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. And we've got two men, both inaugurated as president on the same day. Are we going to have, in effect, a three-way coalition out of this peace deal, with the Taliban being the most powerful of the three partners? Ambassador Liu?
So I think this points to the matter that before we can get into a conversation, or the Afghans can get into a conversation with the Taliban, they have to have an intra-government conversation with themselves. And if you compare—
One would hope the other way would be to go to have the Taliban. Are there the Taliban in effect be kingmaker, or in the strategic center position?
I think what's—
Are there policy differences of a major import between Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah? Is this about policy, or is this about just which one of them run? Ms. Miller, I think you have an opinion on this.
Yeah, it's about power. It's not about policy. Unfortunately, Afghanistan has a system in which an overwhelming degree of power is concentrated in the hands of the president, and that's against the backdrop of a patronage-based political system. So it's a winner-take-all kind of system. They might purport to have some policy differences, but that's not what this is about. It's about who controls the reign of power and patronage.
We could have done a much better job in spending more time before we establish an Afghan government and making sure that that government was acceptable to Pakistan and did not have a winner-take-all corrupt patronage system. But we did what we did. We are, and I yield back.
Let me go ahead and recognize the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I appreciate the opportunity to evaluate the steps this administration is taking to end America's longest-running war. Much work remains to be done, but I am hopeful that the agreement the administration has negotiated will lay the foundation for a lasting peace in Afghanistan. After nearly 20 years and 2,315 brave Americans lost, it will take courage and pragmatism to bring an end to the conflict. However, security in the region must remain central to the peace process. Ambassador Lute, I want to follow up on Mr. Perry's line of questioning. In your testimony, you called the president's deal, quote, an agreement on countering terrorism. As we work towards implementation of this counterterrorism agreement, we must be clear about the Taliban's obligations, and I think that is one of our big concerns. What consequences, again, should the United States set for Taliban backtracking on counterterrorism? You talked about additional strike actions. What else have we got to hold their feet to the fire here?
So we have two main elements of leverage here. One is our presence, so we could stop the troop withdrawal if the agreement is not adhered to by the other party. So if the Taliban, and I think we'll have reasonably good insight in this regard, we'll have good intelligence. If the Taliban don't abide by the letter of the agreement, then we can simply stop the troop withdrawal. The other major influencing factor we have is this continued funding to the Afghan government. We pay, Americans pay $4 to $5 billion a year to keep the Afghan army and police in the field. And we completely take that government responsibility off the Afghan government, and we pay that. In addition, the international community pays another $4 billion, which is about 3/4 of the Afghan federal budget. So the substantial international funding here gives us a lot of leverage, and we should use that leverage.
We should use that leverage. I believe our future engagement with Afghanistan must include ongoing support for the Afghan national defense and security forces to enhance long-term stability in the region. However, it will be difficult, I think, to balance support for the security forces with our commitment to an Afghan-led peace process. Mr. Coffey, you mentioned that the United States should work with regional partners to find a way to continue training Afghan soldiers while inter-Afghan talks progress. How should the United States work with Central Asian nations to build the infrastructure for U.S.-Afghan training programs if American troops are being, in fact, drawn down?
I think one region in this whole campaign in Afghanistan that has been neglected the most is Central Asia. The Central Asian republics want to play, well, specifically Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan want to play a bigger role. They realize they have a lot of stake, and they also realize they have a lot of opportunities available to them if things in Afghanistan turn around. And we have governments in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, especially in the post-Karimov era, that are wanting to play ball with the United States when it comes to Afghanistan, and they've played a leading role in development assistance in Afghanistan. So I think the U.S. should be figuring out, gauging, taking the temperature with these countries on what role can they play, not only for perhaps training Afghan security forces outside of Afghanistan, but if we are going to fully withdraw U.S. forces in 14 months, then maybe having an over-the-horizon force that is very close by will send some sort of message or act as some sort of deterrent in addition to other things as well. But some sort of over-the-horizon force in the Central Asian region that could rapidly respond to anything that pops up in Afghanistan.
Mr. Coffey, you also wrote that the goal of any counterinsurgency is to allow those with legitimate political grievances to address those grievances through the political processes and not through violence.
Yes.
Would this entail some sort of power-sharing agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government?
I would say that this is relative to how the Afghans view what is legitimate or not, or what is a political grievance or not. And this is why, as Americans, as we enter the intra-Afghan talks, we have to resist the temptation to try to get too involved at that stage. The Afghans, Afghan being the Afghan government and civil society, and the Taliban are going to have to determine how the future arrangement will be.
Thank you. I've run out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Let me recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you all for your comments today. Like many of my colleagues and some of our panel, I've had the honor of going out into the dark and killing our enemies. It's an honor to do that for the United States of America. I think daily about the toll. I see it every day. I've mentioned it before as I walk into the Rayburn House office building. You walk in through our horseshoe entrance and you see the wall with the names of our fallen from the War on Terror. I think about it with the men and women that I've seen in places like Walter Reed, those that have been targeted by snipers, those that have ventured across fields of landmines and improvised explosive devices, those whose armored vehicles were struck, those that were in downed aircraft. I think about the empty place settings at the tables of our Gold Star families. Every service member, every Gold Star family should have their chest out with pride for what their service members have done in defense of this nation. They kept our enemies off of our shores. They kept the fight abroad and served with honor each and every day. That being said, I absolutely believe that withdrawal from Afghanistan needs to occur. I do not believe that we should be paying the financial and the human toll of trying to repair or fix Afghanistan. I don't believe that we can fix Afghanistan, personally. And in my opinion, if Afghanistan is captive by tyrants, then they need to fight themselves to remove themselves from that captivity. As I said, I think we need to withdraw. And if peace comes with withdrawal, then even better. But if we withdraw and Afghanistan allows itself to become a place again where terrorism can flourish, and Afghanistan is a place where it becomes a launching point for terrorism, I would offer this as a warning. I believe that the American response, if needed again, would be far more indiscriminate than it's been to date. It would be far more harsh than it's been to date if we were ever forced to return there again. And I offer that as a warning to Afghanis. Now, I want to offer this as well. Whether or not Afghanistan and the Taliban are the same today as they were in 2001, I know for a fact that the United States of America is not the same today as it was in 2001. Our ability to have geospatial intelligence, cyber intelligence, financial intelligence, our ability to go out there and target our enemies is totally different than it was when we began this war. And it's in that I also offer warning for allowing Afghanistan to become a launching point. But it's in that I would ask this question to you all. I believe that a nation can only fix itself. We as Americans, we know that better than anybody. We fixed ourselves. We removed ourselves from tyranny. And to do that, it took toil and suffering and sacrifice. So with all of the comments I've heard about not wishing for Afghanistan to fall back into civil war, I'm not saying that I wish for war, but I see civil war as being the best possible avenue within Afghanistan for them to remove themselves from the tyranny that they fall under, being the Taliban. Why do you all not wish for that conflict to occur, for them to not reach inside internally and remove the cancer that is inside of them and allow themselves to make of their nation what they want? Why do you not want to see that occur?
So let me take a stab at that. My estimate is that if we withdraw precipitously, and this slips into civil war, there's a good chance that the Afghan government would not prevail. I think that despite our efforts over 20 years to build capable Afghan security forces, both Army and police, they're still highly dependent on us just to maintain the stalemate today. So if you withdraw that support, I think we slip into a position of Taliban advantage, especially in the rural Pashtun South and East. And this, of course, is along the models of how the Taliban seized power in the mid-90s, after civil war, after an Afghan period of civil war. So I'm concerned with the outcome of the civil war, and I don't think it would be one. I don't think it's a sure thing that the Afghan government would prevail.
I thank you for your comments. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would offer this one thing to Afghanis. Give me freedom or give me death.
Thank you. If the witnesses would indulge, I think we'll do a second round of questions for those members that have some, and I'll recognize myself for that second round. First off, I thank all of you for your service, and you've outlined the complexity here. If I think about this in simple terms, with the three different power centers, obviously you have the Taliban, you have President Ghani, who I think largely is supported by the Pashtun sector, and then you have Abdullah mostly aligned with the Northern Alliance in that sector. That's simplistic, but in a simplistic way, that outlines some of the complexity. Additionally, I don't know the exact unemployment rate in Afghanistan, but I'm going to guess it's relatively high. I'm also going to guess that the youth unemployment rate, the number of young men that are unemployed, is relatively high. I'm going to guess that there's a sizable number of former Taliban fighters that have been displaced out of Afghanistan that may be residing over the border in Pakistan, et cetera, that if there is peace would return to Afghanistan with nothing to do, without jobs, et cetera. I mean, I guess it's going to be very difficult for this body to continue to justify supporting 75% of the Afghan economy over a long period of time when all of us who do town halls back home, listen to our own constituents talking about how we can't build our own infrastructure, fill the potholes, make college affordable in schools. And that difficulty of justifying that level of financial support for Afghanistan will increasingly be difficult if the Afghans can't come together in some political settlement to govern their own country. And that's not to say that I don't want us to figure out some level of sustained peace, what that looks like. We've invested both blood and dollars there, and we want to give the Afghans a reasonable chance of success, but and we've also got a counter-drug mission there with our DEA, et cetera, and as that seems to be the one economic driver that is sustainable in Afghanistan is the opium trade, and so we do have interest there. Not really. That really isn't a question other than, am I capturing the complexity of it? And then it's in a neighborhood where, India might have an ability to provide some economic development and financial system. Pakistan's not going to want India to be that close. I guess, Ms. Miller, you've grappled with this for a long time. Is that, again, just at a high level, simplistic, the complexity of what we face?
Yeah, no, I think you've illustrated a lot of the complexities, and it's important to remember that a peace agreement, even if it happens, is a limited vehicle for solving these kinds of problems. It can ideally reduce levels of violence considerably by ending the main insurgency, even if there is some continuing violence, but it's not going to solve all of Afghanistan's economic problems, the drug problem, et cetera. It would remove one of the big obstacles to economic growth in Afghanistan, which is the ongoing conflict. But Afghanistan is a place that, it is in a poor, arid, landlocked country that has always been dependent on external resources in some form or another. And I would expect that to continue for a lengthy period of time, even if there is a peace agreement.
And Ambassador Lute, I agree with your assessment that if there was a civil war, that it's not a given, or it's not even a likelihood that the Afghan security forces would prevail here. That the Taliban, as hardened fighters, may actually be in a better position. Just from given your military background and understanding of the region and the large investments we've made in trying to create a capable Afghan security force, we've been at it for years now, and some of that has to come from within. We've equipped them probably with equipment that they don't know how to use or can't use in a real capable fashion. You hear the stories of folks just dropping their weapons and cutting and running. Mr. Mass pointed out that democracy and freedom almost have to come from within, and you've got to fight for it. And we've seen in our own history that we've shed blood to protect our own individual freedoms, our own values of democracy. Do you see that in what's your assessment of the Afghan security forces?
So I don't think we've shown adequate progress given the level of investment. And if there's a number of, say, the top 5 lessons from the last 20 years, this lesson about our ability, or maybe the limits of our ability, to generate indigenous security forces in a place as foreign to us as Afghanistan and as isolated and poor as Afghanistan ought to be in the top 5 lessons. Too often, first of all, we started late. We didn't get serious about funding the Afghan security forces and putting manpower to the Afghan security forces until about 2008, 2009. So we're already 7 or 8 years into this. Second, we tried to mirror image the Afghan forces by making them look like us. We didn't always put our best advisors on the front lines. We economized in terms of our advisory effort. And frankly, we got the Afghan security forces that we paid for. And we poured money in sort of 2010, 2011, over $10 billion a year for those 2 years, but that was overspending because they couldn't absorb that kind of investment. So there are all kinds of rich lessons here to be explored in terms of our ability to build the Afghan forces. Quite frankly, we have pockets of quality in the Afghan forces. The commandos, the special forces are quite good. There are elements of the Air Force that are quite good. But the rank and file of especially the police and the regular army are insufficient, in my view, to provide security for Afghanistan. That's why the big hope here is that you decrease the violence not by imposing security, but by compromise and a political deal. So you take the Taliban off the field because you offer them a spot in the politics. And that's the promise here.
Let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Yoho.
No, I think it's very interesting on which way we go. You know, you got a country that I think the average literacy rate is what, 43%? Illiteracy, yeah. It's high. And so you've got an uninformed electorate, and we know, like in our country, you know, our founding fathers said, as long as you have a well-informed electorate, you can keep a republic. And not that they have a republic, but you've got to start at the basics. And if you look at the population, it's 18 million. I think the average age is 18 years of age. So you've got a whole group of people that have known nothing but war. This is what they've grown up in. This is all they know. They don't know, you know, what we're trying to invoke or place in there. And it's the good work that our military has done, you know, I think, that we've done that. Ambassador Lute, you were talking about our goal according to the peace deal is to prevent the harboring and staging of organizations that threaten the security of the United States. It's in the peace deal. And we have the technology. We can stay here. We can be in Colorado. We can monitor, and we can take out people. We've certainly seen that with Soleimani. But by doing that, it breeds more of those type of beliefs, the radical jihadis that are going to be insurgents. There's got to be a different avenue that we can go, and I'm all for having a third country come broker a deal. I would prefer a Muslim country. I know India's offered to help. Pakistan despises that, but if they do it economically, I'm all for that, because I think the more people that are invested in there that we can work with, not in Iran. You know, I think if we work towards that, and that's why I like the idea, if the Norwegians can do that, if they're willing to take that on, man, I'll support you anyway. And I think we should ease out of that, but I don't see a good solution coming out of this. You know, you've got the Afghan government, the Ghani government, you got Abdullah. As you said, he thinks he's in charge, Ghani thinks he's in charge, and the people within the Taliban, there's different factions that one group has agreed they're in charge, but the other ones don't think that. They don't agree with that. And, you know, God bless the people of Afghanistan. I just hope there's a more cohesive way that we can come out of that. I guess my question is, are you seeing any influence from Iran disrupting the peace process, or any other country, China, Russia, anybody? And I ask you that in that those countries would love to have us stay over there, stay involved, stay distracted. Anybody? Ms. Miller?
There's a lot of hedging going on. And so all of these countries, all of the neighboring countries and the near neighboring countries have their friends and groups that they have influence over, you know, greased by money. And the hedging, as my understanding, has gone up. That's not the same thing as trying to disrupt the peace process. I mean, even Iran would benefit from a somewhat more stable Afghanistan, and there are limits to how much they can hedge with the Taliban, given that there's a lot of bad blood between Iran and the Taliban. So I don't think they want to see them back in a monopoly of power in Afghanistan just to annoy the United States. But it's, you know, I think this is part of the reason why you're going to see a lot of trouble ahead in the peace process, is that rallying all these countries to be working on the same page is going to be very difficult.
Is anybody willing to secure the gains that we've gained, you know, with women in education and things like that? Is anybody willing outside of the United States of America to keep those positive gains? If we were to withdraw, is the Taliban going to be there? Is the Ghani government going to be there, Abdullah, or any other country going to say, you've got to keep this here?
I mean, there are people within Afghanistan, including some associated with the Ghani government and with Abdullah and the other
But
factions.
do they have the will to do that, or the
To
means?
some extent, they have the will. How much this is going to be prioritized is another question. But within the countries of the surrounding region, I don't think this is a prioritized matter.
I agree. I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perry, let me recognize you for.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, keeping on with our discussion previously about our options if the Taliban or the Afghan government doesn't come clean or doesn't fulfill their portion of the agreement, understanding today's a day where milestones are supposed to be occurring, does this allow the United States to change the timeline of removal of any, all, or do we just continue to reduce our complement regardless of their actions, or how tied in are we, or what does this impose upon the United States? How locked in are we to comply?
Well, I guess the next, Congressman, the next several days or even weeks will sort of answer our question, because the agreement itself, in my reading, is vague enough and ambiguous enough for the administration to have choices.
Okay.
You know, so maybe it was specifically designed that way. But on the one hand, we could say, look, there have been violations of the agreement here, and therefore we're going to withdraw faster because the agreement's been violated, or we're going to stop withdrawing.
And
So
of course, the
there's kind of a
Taliban could say, well,
constructive-
you haven't withdrawn, so you haven't showed any good faith, so we're going to continue the things that we do here, right? And that could be part of the equation as well.
That's right. And then we'd see a breakdown
Yeah.
of even this first step agreement, right? So the thing we have in hand right now at least opens the door for the potential of progress.
Look, I agree with you. It just it does concern me that you know, and Mast is a guy that these guys that went and served their country and came home, you know, not the same person that they left. I mean, as a person who was privileged to wear the uniform of our country, I think that part of the thing that we have to do as policymakers is honor the commitments and the sacrifices that American service members have made on our behalf. And to me, honoring those commitments isn't just pulling up lock, stock, and barrel and letting the spoils go to the enemy. I can't accept that. But let me ask you this. Let's say that the agreement, for better or worse, goes generally well, but there's still issues with the Taliban. They continue to attack. Maybe they try and advance their position from a terrorism standpoint or from a military standpoint, if you will. Does the agreement preclude the United States, well, maybe better put, preclude the Afghan government from inviting the United States to keep a counterterrorism presence in the country? Does the agreement preclude that possibility, that eventuality in the future? Anybody? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, according to the wording in the agreement, at 14 months, if everything goes well and intra-Afghan talks are progressing and terrorists are not using Afghanistan as a safe haven, then all U.S. and international forces should be out of the country. Now, whether or not the Afghan government, throughout the course of its intra-Afghan talks, could somehow give a concession that would allow them to negotiate some sort of extended presence of U.S. or international counterterrorism forces. Who knows if this is even a possibility? But if you do read the agreement, by 14 months, if the talks are progressing and everyone thinks that the other parties are living up to their side of the bargain, there should be no international forces in the country.
Anything to add, ma'am?
I mean, Theoretically, a future Afghan government, after a peace agreement of which the Taliban is a part, could certainly invite the United States to continue some kind of security cooperation and counterterrorism mission in the country. Whether that's realistic, I doubt. I mean, the Taliban, it would be very hard for them to actually agree to the presence of foreign forces on Afghan soil, given that that was the whole rationale of their jihad, is to eliminate the foreigners. And frankly, it's also not popular much more broadly among the Afghan population to have foreign forces on Afghan soil. But there's nothing in the agreement that precludes that happening.
Can I explore that with you a little bit? I'm sure it is unpopular to have foreign forces on their soil, but what's not unpopular is to have foreign money to huge amounts pouring in and being the bulwark for their economy. So if one were tied to the other in that regard, what do you suppose the acceptance, maybe not popularity, but acceptance would be?
I think that's a major reason why it's been accepted over these last years.
I don't think we should forget that if we're going to continue to pay, and apparently we are to some extent. Then there ought to be something that comes with that for America.
I think there's a recognition that it's an uncomfortable reality for Afghans that they are dependent on foreigners.
With the chair's indulgence, Mr. Ambassador.
Just one quick point with regard to this question of a potential invitation for American forces to stay or Western forces to stay. In my view, the timelines don't add up. The chances of an intra-Afghan agreement, a real peace agreement in 14 months, I think is just, it's unimaginable to me. This is going to be a long, difficult road. So at the 14-month mark, if we abide by the agreement, because the Taliban is abiding by the counterterrorism part of the agreement, and we withdraw completely, then we'd face a very different question, which is, now there's a new Afghan government and they're inviting us back. That would be another whole set of hearings, I think, before the subcommittee.
I thank you. Appreciate it, Mr. Chair.
I want to thank the witnesses, and y'all use the chair's prerogative and give each of you, if you want to, if there's anything we did not ask or that we should be thinking about, if you want to take a minute or two to make a closing statement, then we'll wrap the hearing. Ms. Miller, if you want to start.
Sure. First, just one quick point related to a question that came up a number of times, which is what kind of enforcement mechanisms are there? There's only one enforcement mechanism against the Taliban, and that's keeping American troops in Afghanistan. There isn't anything else that the U.S. can do. You keep troops there, you kill them. That's pretty much it. Beyond that, I would just mention apropos what Doug just mentioned about how long it might take to get a peace agreement. I fully agree that 14 months would be a very short amount of time to get a real peace agreement that could endure in Afghanistan. I am somewhat concerned that the administration currently seems to be thinking about this in a different way, which is get a fast peace agreement within just a few weeks that is basically a very thin peace agreement that just puts together some kind of interim government, sets out a process for future resolution of issues, but doesn't really resolve any of the problems in Afghanistan. And I think that's a kind of peace agreement that would probably very quickly fall apart in the implementation. So I am a bit concerned about the lack of patience to really see it through in the way that might actually result in a durable peace.
Ambassador Lute.
So the last point I'd make, Mr. Chair, is that while we've spent some time here talking about the limitations of what's been agreed, right? What I think it's important to recognize is that this is the power of diplomacy. I mean, this is the power of a serious, dedicated diplomat like Ambassador Khalilzad, who knows the region, who speaks the local languages. I mean, after all, he's an Afghan American. I'm not sure there's another American who could have pulled this off, even what we have, with all its limitations, right? But it speaks to the power of investing in our diplomats, and here we are, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the status of manning, the status of funding in the Foreign Affairs account for both the State Department, which funds people like Khalilzad, but also the Agency for International Development, which gets to some of the root problems of terrorism and insurgencies, right? And the continued funding of the Afghan government. We've got to turn that around, or else we are destined to constantly put the hammer on these problems, our very capable military, which is often an ill-suited tool. So this should serve as, I think, an example and a reminder of the power of diplomacy.
Ambassador Lute, thank you for making that statement. And, you know, as I often do, I do want to salute, you know, not only our troops, but our men and women in the State Department, our Foreign Service officers at USAID and state for representing our country and the hard work that they do every day. So I fully appreciate that point. Mr. Coffey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. 2 points to conclude on. The first one is echoing the need for patience in holding steady, especially in the earlier days and in the early weeks of this process. It's going to be very bumpy. I heard a lot of criticism, and we've all sort of mocked a little bit the competing governments that exist in Afghanistan right now. But we should not forget that in well-established democracies in Europe, sometimes it takes weeks, and in the case of Belgium, it took a couple of years to form a government after an election. And this is all part of the horse trading that is going on right now, internal, inside baseball, or perhaps there's a good cricket metaphor that could be used, but inside baseball, Afghan politics debate that's happening, and we should give them the space and give them the time to work this out. It's not the end of the world that talks and start today. If they don't start in like 2 months from now, then maybe we should start worrying, but let's just give it some time. The second is, and this wasn't mentioned at all, and I do want to make this point, we have to make sure that the U.S. government throughout this process of withdrawing forces consults very closely with our allies, both NATO and outside of NATO, that have troops on the ground. There's been a lot of consultation with NATO, which is great, but there are a lot of countries that are not in NATO that contribute sizable forces to Afghanistan, like the Republic of Georgia, for example, which I think is the 4th largest troop contributor. And they need to be involved in this because international forces are supposed to withdraw in proportionate to the withdrawal of U.S. forces. And it's no easy logistical task to bring troops out of a place like Afghanistan. So I just ask that we make sure the U.S. government consults with our allies on the withdrawal process if we do, in fact, withdraw forces. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses and all the members for being here today. And with that, the committee is adjourned.